and welcome to the Wellness with Juanita podcast. I'm your host, Juanita Nagai, an American living in Japan for 20 years. I've gone through some massive life changes and crises in my 20 years here. At its bleakest, I felt very isolated, alone, and helpless in the face of what was happening. I relied on alcohol and cigarettes to get through it the best I knew how, which worked until it didn't, and everything fell apart. I made it through with a little help from my friends, a fledgling mindfulness practice, and learning how to become my own strongest ally. I quit drinking and smoking, worked my way through my grief, found ways to forgive, created new connections, and started a regular exercise, meditation, and self-care routine. I've also become a national board certified health and wellness coach along the way, and developed a desire and passion to help others on their own personal journeys. This podcast is all about change, growth, healing yourself, learning how to get back up after life kicks you down, and exploring mindfulness and self-compassion as incredible tools available to each and every one of us to do just that. Hello, and welcome to the Wellness with Juanita podcast. I'm your host, Juanita Nagai. Today, we will be talking about fierce self-compassion. Now, last time I talked about self-compassion in general, which is the idea and the practice of giving ourselves the same kind of care, kindness, and support that we would to a friend in a similar situation, especially when we're going through a hard time, when we're feeling down or facing a lot of stress or difficulty. Self-compassion is the idea that we want to be our own friend and offer ourselves the same kind of support and care that we would. So that may look like offering ourselves kind and supportive words, telling ourselves, I'm so sorry that you're going through this. The idea of common humanity reminds us that it's a normal part of being human to suffer and to have difficulties in our lives. So we can recognize that even if the particular situation might be different, all people go through hard times in life. All people face various challenges and difficulties and stresses. And so there's nothing wrong with you for feeling the way that you do, that it's natural to feel upset or to feel hurt, to feel grief, to feel shame, any of those big emotions that can oftentimes try to overwhelm us and really kind of make us feel very isolated and alone. And the last element of self-compassion, I mentioned the idea that we want to be kind to ourselves as opposed to being judgmental or harsh on ourselves, which is very often the tendency that we do. So the self-kindness versus self-judgment is one of the three elements, and the common humanity is the second. And then the last one is mindfulness versus over-identification. So mindfulness just speaks to the idea that we kind of take a bigger picture, broader perspective as best we can, understanding of what the situation really is. So again, when we're facing difficulties or when we're feeling overwhelmed, a lot of the times we get just completely subsumed and kind of sucked into the story in our head of what's happening. For a simple example, maybe a friend doesn't reply to a text that you were kind of nervous about sending. Maybe, you needed to bring something up that was bothering you, and they didn't write back right away. Well, what can happen is you can create an entire story around that lack of response, right? Oh my goodness, maybe I shouldn't have said anything. Oh, I should have just kept it to myself, or oh, I'm such an idiot, or, I'm asking for too much, or whatever story you might be telling yourself in that silence. In the end, your friend might get back to you a day later and explain, oh, I'm so sorry I couldn't write back right away, but all of these things happened where they were just having a really hectic day themselves or something, right? So there was actually nothing to that story that you made in your mind, but you kind of get wrapped up in it and you get sucked into it. And that is often what happens, especially when we're feeling our most vulnerable or our most scared or sad or alone. We kind of get sucked into this huge drama in our heads of what's going on. So the mindfulness piece encourages us to realize what is happening, no more, no less. We don't want to over-identify with it. We also don't want to deny it. That is another very common coping mechanism. People deny or avoid difficult feelings in all sorts of ways. I'm not going to get into that today, but those are the three basic elements of self-compassion. So mindfulness, common humanity, and kindness. That kind of helps us to explain tender self-compassion, or this kind of loving, kind presence of being with our pain, or being mindfully aware of the suffering that we're going through and wishing to alleviate that in some way. Today, we're going to continue on with the discussion of self-compassion and kind of broaden it out further to think about this element of fierceness. Okay, so fierce self-compassion, as explained by Dr. Kristen Neff, is this idea that we can also protect, provide, and motivate ourselves using self-compassion, or that self-compassion is also the driving force behind those things as well. Now, if we think about fierceness in general, the metaphor that's often used for fierce self-compassion is that of the mama bear. So even if you're not a mother yourself, I think most of us kind of instantly have this image of the mama bear protecting her cubs, right? She's fierce. She's ready to do whatever she needs to do to take care of those cubs. Nothing will get between her and her babies. The mama bear also is going out and she's providing fish for the babies. She's finding resources, fresh water, safe areas. She's ready to take action and do what she needs to do to take care of those cubs. So fierce self-compassion is really kind of harnessing that mama bear energy for our own selves. So again, I think it's easier for us to kind of recognize and identify fierce self-compassion when we see it out in the world in other people. So if you think about things like first responders, when there's a natural disaster or an emergency, they very often put their lives on the line in order to rescue other people, complete strangers. So they are wanting to help people, but they're willing to put their own lives at risk. If you think about single mothers working multiple jobs in order to provide for her family, in order to make sure that she does what she needs to do to provide for her own cubs, for her own children, and alleviate their suffering. Again, it's very compassionate what she's willing to do to work 3 jobs or multiple shifts without much sleep and, without resources for herself. She's willing to put herself on the line and put herself out there for her kids. If we think about marginalized groups or oppressed groups, I think we start to get closer, especially if we identify with one of those groups. So if we think about things like racism and sexism and, gender identity or LGBTQ plus rights and everything. So these different marginalized groups, we can very justly and rightly so start to feel angry that especially people that we identify with, members of our group, are being oppressed or there's injustice that they are facing. So we start to get that mama bear energy. We start to understand how this is not right. Something's wrong. And we want to alleviate their suffering. We want to make things right. We want to make things better. Okay, so if we start to think about different groups that we might identify with, we start to get closer and closer. Again, though, the idea is that we want to learn how to take this energy and be able to harness it and use it for ourselves so that we can provide for ourselves, that we can protect ourselves, and we can motivate ourselves to take the necessary actions and make the change that we need in our lives. So tender self-compassion on the one hand and fierce self-compassion on the other are two sides of this self-compassion coin. And we can think about this in terms of yin and yang. So this ancient Chinese symbol that represents the kind of intertwined duality and balance in the world in general, also helps to kind of think about these two sides of self-compassion. So the tender side is, again, this sense of being with and accepting. It's a loving, connected presence. And then the yang, the fierce side, is the energy of acting in the world, of actually going out and doing the things that need to be done in order to protect, provide, and motivate. So if we think about that quintessential question that self-compassion asks, what do I need right now? What do I need to alleviate my suffering? And we start to think about it in terms of protecting ourselves and providing for ourselves and motivating ourselves. We start to see how we need both of those sides. We need both the tender yin energy and the fierce yang energy to really best complete our own selves internally and the way that we live in the world. And if we can work towards achieving that kind of balance, the better we will be, the better we will feel. You don't want to have too much of one or the other, because then you really are not alleviating your suffering in all of the ways that it might need alleviating. So I want to pause here for a moment because I think that this makes sense on a basic level. Like, okay, that makes sense. If we can use fierce mama bear energy to take care of ourselves, that would be great. But when it comes down to it, the question is, of course, how do we actually do that? I think we can think of historical examples, people like Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, different people that did harness this fierce compassion. They witnessed the suffering of their people, and they realized that there was a grave injustice happening. And then they did what they could to try and alleviate that suffering. And this is where it gets more difficult because, of course, we are not all Gandhi or MLK Jr. We can't all be heroes. However, I do think it's really important to recognize and to realize that we are the hero of our own story. And there might not be anyone else who is going to come along and do the things that we need to take care of ourselves, to defend ourselves, to draw the boundaries that need to be drawn, and to provide for ourselves, to really figure out what we need to feel the most fulfilled and satisfied in our lives. I think all of us can probably think of at least one thing that if we were able to find a way to change it, our lives would be a little bit better. And there's really nobody else in the world better equipped to find the ways to make that change than you yourself. So this is really important. And I think it's really worthwhile to dive in and to try and figure out how we can harness this fierce, compassionate energy to really become our best selves. So at this point, I want to talk a little bit about anger, because I think so much of the fierce energy is helped along, at least, by anger. And I mean, if you think about just even the examples I just gave, like righteous, justifiable anger at the injustices and the cruelty and the oppression in the world. Okay. Gandhi was right. Martin Luther King Jr. was right. There is definite harm and oppression and injustice happening in the world that should be rectified. Okay. And as a woman myself personally, and as women in general, I think anger is one of the difficult emotions that we are basically raised to shy away from, or to repress, or push way down deep, to ignore, to feel like it's something shameful, like good little girls don't get angry. And I think it's just part of our cultural baggage, in much the same way that I think that boys and men are also really crippled by not being allowed to show their softer sides, or to show any kind of emotional intelligence or maturity in a lot of ways. So I think this is, again, kind of a cultural milieu, some cultural baggage that we just are kind of saddled with. But it is important to take a look at it and to recognize that anger is not necessarily bad. It's not necessarily wrong. I think there is definitely constructive anger and destructive anger. And if we think about Kali is one of the major Hindu goddesses. And I am a happy girl right now because I majored in religion, and my concentration was in Hinduism. And in 25 years, I don't think I've ever used that degree in a work setting, but here I go. So Kali is the Hindu goddess of destruction. She is fierce. She is violent. She's depicted holding a man's head, which is her husband Shiva. She's usually standing on his body. She's also got a hand holding a sword, like dripping with blood. She wears a necklace of skulls. I mean, she is fierce. She's got long black hair, blue skin, which is typical Hindu deity coloring. But she is the destructor of the universe, but she is also the mother of the universe and the creator of everything. Okay. So Kali's anger and her fierceness and that awesome power is there for a reason. She's ultimately trying to destroy the illusion of separateness in the world. There is a reason for her anger. And so if we think about this fierce energy that Kali kind of represents, it starts to show us the possible benefits of anger. All right. So there is the idea that it's energizing. It provides us with laser-like focus and clarity. So again, if you think about injustice or social and political movements, the anger that this is wrong, whatever that this is, becomes very crystal clear. And then it provides you the means and the motivation to know what to work towards, what to change, what to fix. Anger helps us defend ourselves and protect ourselves. It's got a very protective quality when, again, we feel like ourselves personally or our group is threatened. There's a wall that instantly comes up. Anger also just simply communicates something's wrong, both within ourselves and to the greater group. So if you think of hearing a racist joke or something, if you respond to that, if your anger causes you to speak up and say, I don't think that's funny, or that's in really poor taste. Not only is it communicating to yourself that something has, offended your sensibilities, but it's also letting others know that you think that that is unacceptable. And then anger also gives us a lot of feelings of control and empowerment. So again, that idea of Kali standing on the body of her husband and holding his head and being very empowered as the ultimate creator and destructor in the world, it's really, really empowering. Of course, there is also very negative aspects of anger. And when it is destructive anger, when you start to lose sight of the idea or the cause of what has made you angry, and you start to put it on individuals, when you start to think of things in terms of us versus them, and all of the baggage and all of the stories that go along with that, I think that's when it starts to get destructive and it can start to be really negative. So when you think about your interpersonal conflicts in the world, whether that's with your partners or your friends or your enemies or whatever it is, when you get really, really angry and you get wrapped up in those feelings, it can be incredibly destructive for you. And holding on to that kind of negative energy can also physically affect you. So there are, any number of sayings about the negative consequences of anger. But one that really sticks with me is anger is like drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. So when it's destructive anger, it can really affect us. And the challenge and the wisdom comes in learning how to discern between that destructive anger that's really just causing your own self-harm and constructive anger, and thinking about, okay, what is the cause of the suffering or the injustice or the pain? And focusing on that, using your anger to think about how that can be changed, what you can do, asking yourself that quintessential question: what do I need right now? How can I alleviate my suffering in regards this injustice or this incident that has happened, and not the person behind it necessarily? Because again, going back to Kali and her destruction of the illusion of separateness, if we can realize that we are all human, we are all part of the human race, we're all part of this universe, this life, this global community that we live in, we realize that we are really kind of all the same and all one in a lot of ways. And so if we start directing our anger at other people, we really are just kind of setting our sights on ourselves again. So I think the idea with understanding our anger is to go back to also our intent and how the anger might be harnessed or utilized to actually help us. So it's not something to just push away or ignore or try or feel ashamed or feel bad about it. To realize that anger is there for a reason. It's trying to communicate to us. It's ultimately trying to help us and protect us. And we can learn to listen to the message that is embedded within it. We often don't act in the best ways when we are angry. And again, we're human. We're not perfect. That is one of the consequences of anger, is that we don't always act in the most cool-headed, even-keeled manner. But we can also use self-compassion to recognize that and to realize that, hey, maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I didn't react or act in the best way. But I can forgive myself for that mistake and realize that my anger was really, really trying to protect me or trying to teach me something, trying to tell me something. Maybe that person really just pushed you way too far over your line. There was a reason that you blew up and got angry. Maybe the actual blowing up was not the most skillful way to handle that particular situation, but there was probably a reason that happened in the first place. So I think that it's important to start to try and listen to the messages and the wisdom that is within our fierceness, whether that is through anger or whether that is through learning how to create stronger boundaries, perhaps, whether that might be sitting down and thinking about, okay, like these things in my life I'm not happy about. What can I do to change them? Are there things that I can do to change them? Because we don't want to simply just sit and kind of nurse our hurts and lick our wounds and offer ourselves support and kindness for all of the hard things that we go through in life. We do, with tender self-compassion, want to offer ourselves support and care and kindness. But that doesn't just mean sitting down and taking it, basically. Like, it also can look like, and it might also mean thinking about where and how we need to stand up for ourselves, or we need to change maybe habits or behaviors that are ultimately harming us. We need to think about what we really want out of life and try and see if we can find creative solutions to start providing those things for ourselves. I think I shied away and was almost kind of scared of my anger and my rage when it came up. Because, for one thing, I don't think I have ever felt that amount of overwhelming anger in my life. I think I've always pushed everything really deep down or thought, that's a bad emotion. I don't want to feel that way. Like, that's not who I am. That's not part of my personality. Like, it's wrong to feel that emotion. However, I realize now, having done a lot of work with myself and with what I went through, I have come to understand and realize that I think that overwhelming cloud fireball of rage was in approximate proportion to the level of hurt and deep, deep pain that it was ultimately trying to protect me from. if I was so incredibly livid and raging and focusing on that, I didn't have to think about how incredibly hurt and wounded I felt. I lived in that rage for a very, very long time. And it started to affect me physically. And it was surprising and overwhelming and very concerning. But I also realized that it had a lot to teach me, that I was able to look at later down the line as I was able. And I do think that there was a lot of wisdom and a lot of truth in it. Again, if we think about bigger picture social causes, there is a reason that Black people in America are pissed off. They absolutely should be. Racism is not an individual personal choice. It is a structured system built into modern day society, especially in America. That's a whole other topic. I'll let that go for now. But there is absolutely a reason that people are so angry and frustrated, and, that the Black Lives Matter movement happened. There's something to be learned in our anger. And I think that that may be the best place to leave you today for the takeaway. I encourage you to think of a specific instance in your life. For this exercise, please try to think of something that is not completely overwhelming and too huge, because when we're overwhelmed, we can't learn. The parts of our brains that are activated when we are really, really angry or when we're really, really ashamed shut down the growth and the learning parts of our brain. So think of something that made you angry, but not overwhelmingly so. And also think of something that actually is important to you, that matters. So not like just you stubbed your toe and it hurt, but think of something in the middle between those two extremes. And I encourage you to think about what happened. How did you feel in your body when the incident happened? Who said what? What was the situation? Try and feel into the exchange and how it made you feel. And then write down also what actually happened. So how did you actually react? How did you actually respond? And what were the consequences of that? Oftentimes if we blow up, there are consequences, but just take note, write those down as well. And then I'd like you to think about what your anger may have been trying to do. Was it trying to protect you? Was it trying to help you? Was it, maybe you don't know. Maybe it just came over you. But try to think about what it might have been doing and see if you can offer some words of thanks to your anger for whatever it is that it was trying to do. And see if you can try to identify what might have been the softer emotion or feeling that was underneath the anger, because there usually is one. And explore that. See if you can touch into that experience and what it made you feel. And if need be, then you can try offering yourself some tender self-compassion to support and care for yourself with those softer, more tender emotions underneath. So thank you so much for joining me again today. I really appreciate you tuning in. I also appreciate any comments, ratings, feedback, sharing, spreading the love, sharing the word of this podcast and what I'm doing. I appreciate it so much. Until next time, thank you and take care.